sharing so we can share. Yes, we will be recording the meeting, and we will make it available on our YouTube channel. Before we get into the content of this report launch, I want to acknowledge that the CCPA Nova Scotia office is located in Shabuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded, unsurrendered ancestral land of the Mi'kmaq people. We recognize that we are all treaty people and we have responsibilities to each other and to this land. Especially in discussing these issues, it is important to reiterate and to recommit to supporting the Truth and Reconciliation Report's 94 calls to action. The first 5 of those calls to action are actually focused on child welfare, on reducing the number of Indigenous children in care, ensuring Jordan's principle is fully implemented, among other calls to action. We also recognize that this land has been occupied for 400 plus years by African Nova Scotians, and that African Nova Scotian children are also disproportionately taken into care, and that all of these families are being harmed by a system that clearly needs reform. We thus commit to actions that will move the work of truth, reconciliation, justice, and equity forward. So welcome, everyone. Welcome and thank you to the authors of this report, Drs Catherine Bryan, Dr. Brooke Richardson, Nancy Ross, and newly minted Dr. Rajean Willis, who wasn't able to be with us this evening. As you will hear, the goal of this research was to understand the challenges faced by child protection social workers within the Department of Community Services and propose short and long-term policy and system changes. Again, we are so pleased to have published this important report called Contradictions in Care, Labor Conditions, Conflicting Values, and Crisis in Child Protection Social Work in Nova Scotia. And of course, the report is available via the CCPA-NS website, and Charisse will put the link in the chat for everyone. So our agenda this evening is to hear a summary of the findings and the recommendations from the authors, but we will also hear from Alex Stratford and Robert Wright from the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. I will moderate and look to keep people on time. So we should have some time at the end for questions. If you could please, if you have a question, if you could put it in the chat, that would help us to enable moderation for the question and answer session. Just noting that I won't be reading out full bios. They are available in the report, but I will introduce speakers briefly as they take turns to present this evening. So let me begin sharing, perhaps. Hold on one second. I'm going to ask Catherine Bryan to begin, but let me just find my PowerPoint.
Sure. Thank you so much, Christine. And so before sort of starting, I just want to offer my deep gratitude for the incredible social workers that we had the privilege to speak to throughout this project. It was hard to hear their stories, but it was also incredibly inspiring. And I think that, it really, it was, we talked about difficult things, but at the same time, there was a lot of hope. And I think that hope is sort of situated in those workers, in those social workers. And so it was just, again, a kind of honor to be able to spend time with them and to talk with them. So I want to also sort of begin by stressing that the problems of child protection social work are systemic. So our objective is not to deride individuals, even those with relative power within the system. But as a system, like all others of the state, child welfare must be accountable to the people it serves and to those whose labor is vital to the provisioning of services. Of course, I get a phone call. State systems do not have entitlements, they have responsibilities. And the work of the CCPA Nova Scotia office is to hold the Nova Scotia government to account when it fails to meet those responsibilities in ways that are just, equitable, and meaningful. And so our project very much aligns and responds to this mandate. So our research was guided by 4 questions. The first, what are the experiences of critically trained social work practitioners in their work in child protection? 2, how do workers understand the conditions of their employment and in turn navigate and meet their responsibilities vis-a-vis the existing child protection system? 3, what are, from the perspectives of child protection social workers, the implications of their labor conditions on the children, youth, and families that they serve? And then finally, what is required for a more just, compassionate, and empowering child welfare system? So to answer these questions, in the summer of 2024, which now feels like a decade ago, we interviewed 15 child protection social workers. Participants were mostly white settlers with a small number of African Nova Scotian and Indigenous social workers. Interviews lasted from 60 minutes to 5 hours, and participation was very much regarded by those we interviewed as a form of advocacy. And so what emerged from our conversations and what we'll be talking about in some detail this evening was a uniform description of a system in crisis. And Christine, you can maybe flip to the next slide. We just have some quotes. So the overview continued. That's okay. So the crisis that they talked about was revealed in the sort of daily conditions of their labor. So the lack of time and space to practice according to their values, training, and professional code of ethics, experiences of racism, exclusion, and disempowerment, a depth of moral and psychological distress, and the persistent sense of being devalued, poorly understood, and reflected in those high levels of moral distress, being complicit in a system that at the end of the day might do more harm than good. So that's sort of, you'll see, the words of our participants will be in front of you, and you'll be able to sort of hopefully see some of these themes in the details of our findings that we're going to provide this evening. So Christine, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much. Dr. Catherine Bryan, who I was actually going to say a few words about before I introduced you, who is the lead author on this report with this incredible team, who is a social anthropologist and a social work educator at Dalhousie University, as well as a CCPANS research associate. And I thank you, Catherine, for laying the groundwork. I'm actually going to ask Alec and again, I know we have quotes in front of you. We haven't read them out. They are obviously in the report, and this is a lengthy report. It really does center the voices of the participants. And so we do encourage you to please have a read through the report, because these quotations, as you see before you, do really obviously capture what the findings and recommendations are. Alec Stratford, could I ask you to lay a bit of foundation for us, a little bit of context in terms of the legislative context of the work? You, as executive director and registrar of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, know well what that context is. So could you explain what the Child and Family Services Act is and why that's so important for us to understand as we think about these working conditions?
Thanks so much, Christine. Welcome everyone tonight. Really, again, this report is crucial to how we understand this really paramount system in our society. At the end of the day, what social workers and child welfare are here to do is to uphold and assure that children's rights are protected in Nova Scotia, and that families and children together can reach greater well-being. Now, the report itself goes into a bit more detailed history of the evolution of children and family services legislation in Nova Scotia. It's important to remember that the original child welfare legislation was an adaptation of a legislation that was in place to protect animals. And that, again, we had rights to protect property before we had child rights in Nova Scotia. Um, that evolution of legislation evolved, as did our society. We saw major revisions to Children and Family Services Act in 1991, which did work to modernize and professionalize child welfare services. The 1991 Act did a number of things, particularly define what child in need of care was, solidify again child rights and law in Nova Scotia. It also had attached to it standards and parameters that really tied interventions to pretty intrusive and pretty demanding forensic evidence before child welfare workers could intervene. There were some challenges with that just in terms of how work was done. In 2015, the work to amend the Children and Family Services Act started to begin. And again, we started to see more challenges and problems unfold. Again, what we saw was a shift of having the need for really robust forensic evidence to justify intervention, to having just a presumption that child welfare services were needed. Again, at the time, the Stephen McNeil's Liberal government was in power, and their minister, Joanne Bernard, stood up in the legislature and stated these changes were needed so that we could intervene in families at an earlier place. Anyone who's a child welfare expert will tell you, or anyone who's worked in child welfare, that to intervene earlier, we never needed more or more robust or a change in legislation. What we needed foundationally was the resources to be able to support families. So we changed again needing forensic evidence to opening it up, and changed again some of the definitions that broadened what defined a child in need of care, including a definition of neglect that reads as though if you live in poverty, you could be subject to intervention from child welfare services, as well as challenges with how we look at gender-based violence within the Act. But problematically, and what has risen into the crisis that we see today, there were a number of core changes that increased the workload and caseload of social workers, particularly, again, looking at the mandatory duty to report that was placed on professionals, as well as, again, provisions around when a child needed to come in care. What we've seen that happen since we've done that, and what the evidence has shown long before we did that with those mandatory duty to report provisions, is that it created a context for the over surveillance of predominantly poor racialized families, which subjects them to more child interventions than what's normally required. And the data clearly shows that increased workloads for social workers in terms of needing to have more cases to investigate, to intervene on, as well as more cases going to court, and so it just adds to the extent of workloads in that regards. Problematically as well is that, of course, everyone in the system is always there to work in the best interest of the child. And of course, children have very different perceptions of time than we as adults do. So there was a conscious effort to recognize that the system needs to move quickly towards permanency. But what the legislation did was bind us to timelines towards intervention under the threat of permanent care and custody, while also not putting in place the resources to effectively achieve that intervention. So now when a child comes into care, the clock starts in terms of, particularly if they're coming into temporary care, the clock starts, and access to the resources that are needed, such as housing, food, income, as well as the self-actualizing and support and family programs, are all sparse to begin with. All of those services are overloaded, not to mention there's a lack of culturally relevant programs, and in rural areas, even less access. So it created a context in which social workers were asked to do more with less. And that has contributed to the crisis we have today. Now, I want to be clear, we could have the most perfect act with the best language possible. And without again, the resources in community, the substantial effort to remove and eliminate child and family poverty, without good affordable housing, we're still going to be in the same situation. So the act was an important piece and is an important piece that governs this entire field. And again, ultimately, everyone working within the system is working under the framework of this act. But the issues really lie in how we value care in our society. Again, making sure that and recognizing that those who are doing the work of care, one, are highly skilled, do a great deal of emotional labor on a daily basis. And that in and of itself creates a context for that moral distress and moral injury to flourish. And we have a system that doesn't recognize that.
Thanks, Alec. I know the depth of expertise that you bring to this issue, and I would suggest, if people haven't already, I mean, the college's website itself is a resource. They've been, intervening and advocating on these issues. I know the act is under review, and I know the college has submitted its analysis of what needs to change, and we should be hearing from this new government in the next few months about that review. So I appreciate you setting that stage. And Dr. Nancy Ross, I think it's a good way to lead off and digging a little bit deeper into the findings, the first of which was really around the failures of the Children and Family Services Act and what that did in terms of caseload, overload, and complexity. If I could ask you to explain certainly that finding and a little more. What did we hear about?
Sure. I'm going to comment on the first four findings, and some of those have multiple parts. So this first slide the first couple of slides speaks to the overload, and the last one to the complexity. So as Alex mentioned, the amendment to the Children and Family Services Act was meant to be proactive. However, he really eloquently said the ways in which it limited access to the funding and resources and resulted in more stress for frontline child protection workers who had to do so much more with less. So it limited their ability to provide that care that they wished to. And also it resulted in an increase in the referrals. All right, if we could go to the next slide. I chose quotes that I thought were very representative of their voices, and I think I will read a couple as we go through these first four findings. So when I began this work, I was told caseloads were high, that we were short-staffed. That was a number of years ago. Things have rapidly declined. It's definitely the worst I've ever seen it. And that was the sense that we had across all of the interviews, is that even in the last 5 years, that the situation has declined. At the same time, the caseload has increased and also the complexity. As you can see here, the next quote, one person said she had 50 cases, and that policy dictates that they are to have no more than 20. And it can be up to 100 people. It's important to realize that when we talk about a case, we're talking about a family, and we're also talking about people related to that family. So when we say 20 cases, it could imply up to as many as 100 people you're responsible for. So in terms of the complexity, I liked this quote because it recognizes the changing social context in our province. So the files we're getting are changing, particularly with the growing number of newcomers. There's a lot of mental health struggles, families who've experienced war, families who've lived in refugee camps, and we feel very helpless because we don't have the services. And also, many of our participants said they've felt they needed more training, particularly in trauma-informed approaches, which we will get to. It's usually not just substance use or family violence. It's sometimes substance use, family violence, and unfit living conditions. There's many layers to go through. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So finding two, this was such a pronounced finding among all those interviewed, the lack of time. So there were always just new referrals, but never enough staff or enough time in the day. And what do frontline child protection workers do? There's such a range and variety in terms of the expectations of their work. So below, we see a list of some of those duties that they could be called upon during a day or within 2 weeks. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So every second week, we have a day off. We have 18 working days in a month. That's without vacation, without holidays. So any vacation or holiday decreases our coverage because our numbers are so low. We're on coverage up to 6 days a month, so that's 6 days that you book around in your schedule. Now you're down to 12 days a month to see every single one of your kids. That's like 5% of the job, and so 12 days to see 21 kids as well as everything else. I feel that really puts things into perspective, like the demands on us. So you can hear in the voice of this participant the frustration that they experience in terms of wanting to have a relationship with children and not having the time to do it. So you think about your kids all the time. And that was something that I thought was very, very touching in the ways that many of our participants said they took their work home with them, even though they knew that was something they tried not to, and they frequently thought about the kids on their caseload. So then it's that fear that something's going to happen, like a child could die, and we're not going to know because we just can't handle all the work and we're not being supported. When we bring this up, we're told that we just need to be better at time management. Here you see that the pressure that our participants felt, and in this participant's words, you can see that often they felt unsupported by their senior management. Okay, if we could go to the next. So in terms of finding three, constant turnover and chronic understaffing. So there was a lack of consistent workers. Our participants said that if you had worked for Child Protection Services for 3 years, you would be considered a senior worker. There's often a revolving door, it seems, with new workers coming and those leaving. Lower than ever retention rates, and there was that sense that this was increasing, that there's slow hiring and short-term replacement processes, and a lack of transparency and accountability around promotion. So in Nova Scotia, between 2017 and 23, there was an 80% increase in social worker resignations. And short-term illness has been steadily on the rise, increasing 30% between 2017 and 2023. I think this speaks volumes to the stress that our participants felt in trying to do an impossible job. I was asked to respond alone to an incident of family violence. I didn't know if the perpetrator was still in the home. Another time, respond to a file, and I wanted someone to go with me because I'd never been there before, but no one was available. I went to the home and was bitten by their dog. It chomped down on my leg. In that moment, I felt so overwhelmed. I was in pain. It hurt. But I had to do another home visit. I couldn't check my leg for injuries. It was like, I have to get this done. If another social worker had been with me, I could have said, let me step outside or make sure I'm not injured, that I don't have to go get a tetanus shot. Okay, the next slide. So I would say is 6 months to a year. So then at a year, you're suddenly a senior social worker on the team, which is, I mean, you haven't passed through the candidacy process. So that's not a great situation. And then when I started on the team, everyone had at least 3 years plus experience. Now to find someone with 3 years experience, I mean, they would be viewed as very experienced in child protection. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So finding 4 was insufficient training and lack of mentorship. So without more concrete training and formalized forms of mentorship, participants felt the department was setting new social workers up to fail. So early career child protection workers did not feel prepared for their job. And those with more seniority and experience worried about their junior colleagues. Core trainings often go unfinished or delayed. And then also that lack of ongoing mentorship meant that individual workers did not feel able to resist instructions they did not ethically agree with. So ultimately, they felt alone and ill-equipped to voice their concerns. So in their words, insufficient and delayed training. So across the 15 interviews, we heard a lot about the lack of training and the lack of it being delivered in a timely manner as well. So to do good social work, it takes a lot of energy and confidence. And here you're going in with 0 experience and 0 training. There's no reason why they can't train new people before they come to the front line. I mean, I got the last of my training years into the job, like the training you need just for everyday functioning the job, the basic fundamentals, all of that many years in, I needed it so much earlier. So the department has many jobs that are designated for members of equity-serving groups, Indigenous social workers, African Nova Scotian social workers, and racialized newcomers, which is really good and necessary. But they're actively recruiting people, and then they're setting them up for failure once they're here. So the department needs to continue in the spirit of that recruitment and support workers once they're in. Okay, we could go to the next slide. I think we're now going to move on to Catherine, who's going to share with us findings related to 5 and 6.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Christine, is it okay if I just go, or would you like to do a little introduction? I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. State systems like child welfare are, incredibly kind of contradictory in nature. So their origins, as we know, are inherently problematic and violent, and they correspond to the objectives of the Canadian colonial state and capitalist political economy. And this is a violence that we know kind of carries forward. State institutions, again, like child welfare and social welfare policies more broadly, are really meant to limit the impact of this violence in people's lives, providing them with the resources and supports that they need to survive our current sort of social and economic system. But yet, time and time again, right, they do the opposite. Instead, these institutions kind of reproduce and reinforce the problems that they're ostensibly charged with redressing. And so in this context, social workers become the kind of embodiment of the state and its conflicting objectives in people's lives. So they're called on to support and to care, but equally so, they're asked to enact the sort of disciplining and controlling function of the state. So social workers are understood, and to a degree they do, occupy positions of extreme power in people's lives. And yet, and Alec was talking about this, the gendered sort of organization and the chronic devaluation of their work dramatically diminishes the authority and potential positive impact that they might have. And reflecting the primary concern of all of our participants, this in turn has serious negative implications for the children and family involved in the system. And so this kind of tension is really at the core of our last two findings. So thanks, Christine. So aside from the kind of very practical day-to-day challenges faced by workers that Nancy described, those that we spoke to consistently returned to two other sort of overarching and connected themes. That was that no one inside or outside of the system seems to understand what social work is and what child protection social workers do. And then two, that their work is consistently devalued and derided. And so, what is social work? What do we need to understand about social work? Those of us who, or those of you who are not social workers may not have a clear sense of, what is social work? So social work is a sort of deeply relational set of practices that are embedded within deeply problematic state systems. And so a professional social work practice requires a depth of cognitive, emotional, and affective intelligence, in addition to complex expertise in appropriate modes of intervention, client history, family dynamics, and child development. It's also highly technical. So it demands that workers understand, navigate, and operationalize complex legislated policies. At the center of all of this, though, is always the relationship. So social workers do all of what I just described while simultaneously engaging in incredibly complicated interpersonal work with people who are often at the worst moment of their lives, right? So it really is demanding and taxing, but it's also critical, and under the right conditions and with the right supports, it can be rewarding and meaningful for both the worker and those that the worker is serving. So what the workers we interviewed stressed, right, was that the complexity of the work and the skills needed to do it effectively were consistently downplayed. As one participant expressed, right, they, right, meaning higher ups, think that we're here to check boxes, right? And so this sentiment was relayed across all of the interviews, right? It came up repeatedly that those higher up in the system didn't appear to be particularly invested in how the work was done, but rather that it was simply done. And so in turn, our participants were consistently or are consistently faced with an ethical dilemma, right? So check as many boxes as possible to meet the system's requirement, or develop meaningful supportive relationships with children and parents to meet the family's needs. And so doing both, they explained, was exceedingly difficult. You can go to the next slide, Christine. So our participants very much understood this tendency toward misunderstanding as connected to their relatively devalued status, and again, the gendered organization of their work. So the sort of socially constituted feminized nature, so to speak, of their work leaves it vulnerable to broader processes of devaluation, which are reflected in how it's organized within the day-to-day work of child protection. That said, more than sort of simply about them, about the workers, they also understood this devaluation of their work as very much a reflection of the status of their clients, both within the system and more broadly. And so, as one of our participants explained, it's women's work, and a lot of the focus of intervention is women, and that's why so much of it is devalued. It's like what people pay their babysitters versus what they pay their plumbers. This work needs to be resourced in a way that demonstrates that we actually value kids and the families that are raising them, but it's not. It's not resourced in a way that demonstrates that they're valued. Another worker said, I also sometimes feel that it has to do with the parents not being in the labor market. Often the parents we're working with aren't. So we're working with people who are already not valued. Society is already telling them they're not doing a good job, they should be working, but they just need help. They should be able to raise their kids. I mean, yes, some of these situations need social work and social workers, but it needs to be resourced in a way that when a problem is identified, we can provide the necessary wraparound supports to help the family work through the problem to keep the family intact. You can go to the next slide, Christine. So the devaluation of their work is revealed in a number of ways. So the conditions that Dr. Ross described, the lack of time and space, training, mentorship, etc., but also in more sort of subtle ways. So the lack of decision-making authority extended to the workers, their lack of agency, the lack of essential designation during COVID, right? So that was huge for these workers. The tendency to shuffle workers between roles and offices, including administration positions when they were vacant. So here the workers sort of spoke about their perceived interchangeability, that somehow they were all the same enough that they could fill vacancies across the agency, regardless of their actual designation or job description. So the sentiment very often was like, well, this is women's work, isn't it? There's no actual skill involved. The social workers are all interchangeable. I mean, women are interchangeable. It's pretty predictable. I truly feel like we're just seen as bodies. So reduced to just bodies, the expectation is that these workers perform their duties according to regulation, under duress, absent any consideration of their skillfulness, training, and expertise, and that they do the same for colleagues in their absence. And then finally, devaluation is sort of revealed in the lack of meaningful support that these workers are able to access in the service of their own mental health and well-being, a lack of accommodation for their own family responsibilities, and this unrelenting sense that if they don't do the work at literally any cost, that something terrible is going to happen. So the next slide. This is a quote about COVID and just the sort of discrepancy between other frontline essential workers, if we consider the police essential, which perhaps we don't. And so finding 6. What became incredibly clear through the interviews is it's not only that workers struggle to do their jobs well under these conditions, but that they themselves struggle to be well. And so workers reported fatigue, anxiety, depression, and burnout, resulting in short and long-term leave. And then in some cases, resignation. Workers talked about lunch taken at their desks, if at all, working in the evenings, leaving their own children with family on days off to go on emergency home visits, the guilt they felt for going to personal medical appointments, not being able to use the toilet for hours at a time, and of privatizing their distress. And Christine, if it's not too much trouble, could you go back to slide number 5? But if it's too much, that's okay too. And they also talked about their fear, right? So returning to my opening remarks of being complicit. And it is, sorry, number 5, like right at the beginning, almost. Sorry, I'm a pain.
No, you're not.
But it is a very, I think, important, the one right before it.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that this quote really captures this anxiety, right? So she says, one file stands out as an example. We were stopping into the home pretty consistently for a while, sometimes weekly, but sometimes 3 times a week. And the conversation with the team was like, is mom doing enough? Knowing that coming into care is traumatic, are we going to do a better job than what she's doing? And the answer was no, we can't do better. And this is the piece, right? She goes on to say, we, the system, had raised that mother. We had raised her without the skills she needed to care for her own children. And it's the we, right? It's the way in which the participant is identifying with the system that she perceives as harmful. And so it's this sense of being complicit or of working not in the service of their kids and families, but of the system itself, that for many is the source of their moral distress, right? They want to provide their clients with the best possible support to ensure the best possible outcome, but consistently feel unable to do so. And so, through this project and through my teaching, I'm constantly kind of like returning to the why. Like, why would a system charged with supporting people limit their ability to do so deliberately or otherwise? And I think to sort of wrap up the discussion of our findings and before turning to Brooke for some discussion and our recommendations, we can look to the interviews for a potential answer. And, the undercutting of critical social work practice and of social work's professional authority through reduced funding, through a lack of resources, through the persistence of those conditions that we've described tonight, is how the state manages to most effectively operationalize its authority in and over people's lives. And this is something that we all need to resist. So well-resourced, empowered social workers challenge the status quo. Under-resourced, disempowered social workers have little ability to do differently, to be anything but complicit, which perhaps, and maybe this is, too much suspicion, but perhaps at the end of the day, that might be part of the objective. And I certainly hope not. And I hope that by sharing with all of you tonight our findings and shortly our recommendations, that we'll all be sort of better positioned to insist on a more caring system. So Christine, I'll pass it to you and then on to Brooke.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bryan and Dr. Ross. Both are at the Faculty of Social Work at Dalhousie, and both are CCPA&S research associates. And I so do, again, value this work, the publication, and the way you have presented these findings. I am actually going to turn to another one of our fabulous authors, Dr. Brooke Richardson. Brooke Richardson is an assistant professor in child and youth studies at Mount St. Vincent University, and she's also a CCPA&S research associate. And Brooke, where Dr. Bryan left off around this experience of moral distress, we thought it really important to really dive in to understand this risk-based system and really how does it affect the workers, how does it affect children and families, and I'll turn it over to you to discuss that for us, to really put that into perspective so that we understand that piece.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. So I'm Brooke, and I guess I bring my lens to the project because a little bit my background is social policy, public policy, and I really try and think about these issues in the child protection system from the perspective of children and families as well. So while the report was very much focused on the workers, I was always trying to insert that lens of, well, what does that mean for families as well? And so actually this kind of is nice. We kind of come full circle because Alex sort of opened with the legislative changes in 2017, which I really perceive as a further entrenchment into a risk-based system. And so I guess I just want to be, what are we talking about when we're talking about a risk-based system? Because sometimes we have to kind of zoom out in order to think about how we zoom in and move and what we do moving forward. Because the problems that we're engaging with here are so complex. So I think it's just worth pointing out that when the existing child protection system that we have in Nova Scotia and in most North American jurisdictions are very highly individualistic. So they look at human beings in a very cost-effective, rational way. There's this assumption that we have the knowledge or we can accurately predict future harm. So we're constantly thinking about the future and less about what are the family's needs right now. And then we're also really focused on trying to prevent the worst things from happening. And so it's interesting, this is not in the report, but I think we do see right now a discursive shift happening in Nova Scotia in the child protection scene with the language of well-being, which of course we all want the best for children's well-being, but I think it's really important to say that language itself is not enough. And if we are continuing with the same mechanisms, which Alec also mentioned, like surveillance, control, coercion, reliance on forensic evidence, these sorts of approaches, we're not fundamentally disrupting and we're not moving towards something that's going to actually make children and families well. So I think, we have to, you can move to the next slide. Yeah, so and that fundamentally comes down to where are we locating the problem? Is the problem with the mothers, the problem with the fathers, the problem with the child? Or do we have a lens where we can actually, and that's what risk-based systems do. They look for red flags in order to intervene to prevent future harm, but unfortunately they don't work. They aren't working, they haven't worked, and and they too could be very costly. So if we have to look broader, it's not necessarily that individual child or that individual family or that individual mother. There's all these structural pieces. And we can't, if our focus is trying to fix an individual without those systemic supports or structures, we're setting families up to fail. Next slide. I have to say, so I recently, I would be, I guess, a come from away. I'm recently moved to Nova Scotia from Ontario. And so I'm very familiar with, child protection systems, and I work and I write in a national and an international context. But there were some really interesting things that I observed in Nova Scotia that really caught me by surprise, and that came up in the interview. So one of the things that came up was which is very reflective of risk-based thinking, is this pro-arrest, pro-charge in cases of intimate partner violence, where we saw, this was actually kind of surprising to me that there was, a public policy that saw the automatic criminalization of folks who were impacted by domestic violence. And that was just very troubling to me and continues to be very troubling to me, particularly from the perspective of mothers who are often, very much trapped, unable to get the supports they need, and then further involved in a criminal investigation and a child protection investigation, and then sadly often held responsible through a failure to protect their children discourse. So again, it's looking at it from it seems this is kind of what happens with public policy often, is we have these like top-down solutions that seem to make rational sense. But unfortunately, when you talk to the people who are living these policies, they don't have the intended effect. And that's what we're seeing with like something like this pro-arrest, pro-charge, and then the larger risk-based system. Slide. So what we saw, as Kat talked about, and where Alec began, if that 2017 reform, which I genuinely believe was well-intentioned, I don't think anyone has poor intentions here. But when we crack down on minimizing risk, without looking at the humans that are trying to live their lives, we end up with more referrals, but fewer resources. And, sadly, we get workers, and who are reduced kind of to their professional agency is compromised because they have these rigid structures to which they must adhere, to the point where they become pawns in the system. That's my language. That's not language that was used by anybody, but it certainly, to me, is fundamentally interconnected to those extremely high level moral distress and burnout that we're seeing among workers. And I think it's important to also just point out here that mothers and families and children are very aware of the issues that the workers themselves also identify in this report. And they are, so in a recent report that was released by Coverdale, one of the mothers actually expressed how the overwhelm of the workers, was a real problem for her, because she couldn't get a hold of her worker. She couldn't talk to this person, and she didn't, and this mother was not angry with the worker. She understood, but it was like this perpetual cycle. Oh, thanks for putting the Coverdale report out. Yeah, and so you get this, and then we have the intersection. So Kat did such a beautiful job of talking about the systematic devaluation of care labor, but we also see within the child protection system the intersection of mothers, as she talked about, workers who are mothers, but then also those who are responsible for the day in, day out care labor of children. These are the mothers coming into the system. And so you've got these marginalized women all with these overwhelming care responsibilities, and without any of the supports that any of them need to be able to care well for their children. Because the bottom line here is that if we aren't caring for the workers, and we aren't caring about the workers, and we aren't listening to the workers, then we are not caring about and for children and families. That is kind of a full stop. Next slide. Yeah, so basically that's what I'm saying. So if workers don't have time, that family voice is not going to be there. There's a lower threshold for intrusive interventions, and being investigated by child protection, which workers very much appreciate, is terrifying. It's scary. It's not something that feels supportive for children and families. And the workers we talk to get that. And they recognize, I think Kat also spoke really eloquently about that. Like they recognize the limitations of and how it conflicts with their own ethical responsibilities. Sadly, it means such changes means families put more energy and time into navigating the system, right? Rather than just making sure their child has lunch or can get to their doctor's appointment or whatever. Now they have to make sure the child protection worker has the documents they need from the doctor. So it becomes another administrative piece, right? And workers understand. It was very clear in the interviews that workers understand that. And don't want to contribute to that, but also have to fulfill their own responsibilities. And then, of course, with all of these pieces intersecting, we see the overrepresentation of marginalized groups perpetuated. So the data is so clear on this, but in 2021, 53.8% of children in Canada's foster care were Indigenous, despite representing less than 8% of the child population. In Nova Scotia, 50% of the children in care were Black or had one Black parent. And in 2021 and 2023, of children and youth in care homes in Nova Scotia, 11% were Black or African descendant and 18% were Indigenous. So we see this, none of that is going to be interrupted if we continue to use the same risk-based lens and systems and mechanisms that we already rely on. I just want to also point out the report of the Auditor General that pointed out that same idea that workers are not just bodies. And a lot of the same issues that we identified in our report came up in that report as well. I think where we kind of want to just be a little bit different or distinguish ourselves is, coming up with solutions that are not necessarily so rooted in the existing system, but trying to imagine other ways of doing our things or other possibilities. So not necessarily, more time management or check boxes or tick boxes. Those aren't the solutions where we're going to get where we need to go. So we tried to, this was a really challenging task, to come up with recommendations. What do we do? This is a conversation that's going on across Canada and across the world, right? Because there is an increasing recognition that the way we're approaching protecting children is not working for anybody. So I think for purposes of this and this report, I think it might be helpful to think of it in terms of both short-term and long-term. So we have a system, particularly in Nova Scotia, that is, for lack of a better term, it's bleeding. There's not the people there. It's in a real crisis. So we have to address kind of the short-term things. We need things like immediately. We need more workers. We need more case. There has to be case caps. We have to have. These are just very basic things. Training needs to be available. That's the very basic thing that needs to happen. But we need to also think bigger and think about, okay, well, how can we support families? So things, childcare, housing, all those. If we cannot access the resources to give families what they need in the moment, then we are not going to be getting out of this cycle that we're in. One thing I think that is, definitely improve responses to gender-based and partner violence, making sure children and families have voices in these processes. And along with that, I think really urgent to address and relatively straightforward for a government to address is establishing a child and youth advocate office, because we don't have in Nova Scotia a mechanism when major violations of children and families' rights occur. for anyone to do anything. So Nova Scotia that don't have this, and I think that is something that should be an immediate action of any government that claims to take seriously the needs of children and families in Nova Scotia. And so all of this is leading to addressing and developing and supporting a social model of care where we're not so focused on a red flag model, but actually having the time and the resources necessary to be able to support families, to be able to spend time with families. Workers are not interchangeable. Even if you have two of the most highly qualified, amazing workers in the whole wide world, if a family has a relationship with one worker, that's not interchangeable ever. So we have to think about the actual humans who are developing these relationships, where they're coming from. Because one of the things that also struck me in this report was the lengths that a lot of workers went to, bending over backwards, keeping files because they kept relationships and those relationships mattered to them. And so they would break the rules or bend the rules in ways to best support families. But what that does is that puts individual workers at taking on their own risk for their own employment and their own well-being. And so truly what I think these interviews really reveal to us is there's a group of absolutely incredible, predominantly women, holding this system together right now, and not being recognized for that work. And that's where public policy really needs to change. And it needs to change with the voices of the workers, with the voices of the children and youth, and with the voices of the families. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much to the authors. Thanks, Brooke, for ending there with the recommendations. I'm so pleased that we have Robert Wright with us this evening. I don't even know what to say, Robert. You have 35 years as a sociologist, as a social worker. I think your depth of knowledge and experience is unmatched in Nova Scotia, and I absolutely appreciate to hear from you. I think I've certainly heard from Alec and from others that in really, this is not news, but here we have a 90-page report centering the voices of social workers in child protection in Nova Scotia, and so we would love to hear your thoughts. And then to those who are joining us, if you have comments, questions, please put those in the chat, because we do have a bit of time after we hear from Robert to have some discussion. I see others in the room who also have experience and perhaps would like to add comments, but absolutely appreciate you being here. And I will turn it over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone so far for your contributions. And I also want to acknowledge that there are some folks in the room with us that I would consider veterans of the field. So I guess in terms of responding to this, there's just one little story that I would tell. I remember I was the executive director of child welfare in Cumberland County ages ago, but I remember I first went to Cumberland County as a casework supervisor. And I was very young, the most junior member of the administrative staff, and within months, one of the social workers, the most senior frontline child protection worker, was in my office, just talking about the stresses of her work. And she ended up in tears, crying about the workload that she was under, and talking about the impossibility of serving families under the current conditions with which she worked. And then she pulled herself together and stopped crying and apologized and left my office. And I remember, as a very junior supervisor, feeling my responsibility and the empowerment to go to the executive director and to say very plainly, we have a crisis here, and I'm sharing it with you. And if you can't resolve this in 2 weeks, I will have to address it from my location as a casework supervisor, because this can't happen in this agency. And I walked away from her. And within the 2 weeks, we had additional resources to hire an individual to divide that caseload and to do work. But I just feel like it was a very different time, that the workers' distress was heard by a casework supervisor. The casework supervisor was able to identify to the executive director that there was an imminent crisis, and that the executive director could appeal to a system that was responsive and met our needs. And that is seemingly not happening today. And I don't think that anybody, after reading this report, could say that those people who are in the community talking about a real imminent crisis in child welfare could be anti-child welfare worker. This report, though it acknowledges that it's responding to the needs of families and children in our province, it centers the experience of child welfare workers as the barometer for the crisis. And so we're dealing with a system that is not only in crisis by virtue of the conditions of facing families that it serves, but the condition of the people who are working to support and to serve those families. And let's be clear, the dual role of relationally connected helper and state deputized authority is a crazy-making role that must be supported with deep training, supportive mentoring, and unfettered access to rich community-based resources to meet the needs of the most challenged families that we serve. Otherwise, the role is structurally untenable. Right? Otherwise, no matter how skilled, no matter how trained, no matter how, unless a person was born on Krypton or was struck by lightning and had the powers of Flash, there is no way they could accomplish the work as it is structurally designed today. So I think we need to acknowledge that. I liked the comments in the report that talked about how we are conceptualizing this work as individualized work with families that are individually assessed as being at risk, and how that work, that construction, doesn't really help us to find the larger solution to the bigger problem. We can do better work beyond this individualized approach to child welfare by studying trends in identified risks, what we used to in the day call major presenting problems. What are the problems that the families are experiencing? And not only what are the problems, but where is the geography where those problems are evident? We could, if we took that information, we could identify community-based interventions that were targeting the nature of problems at the community level. And I remember, again, I talk about the old days as a director of child welfare, seeing a trend in parent-adolescent conflict cases and sitting with my senior staff and with the executive director of the local parent resource center and saying, what can you do as a parent resource center to support parents who are having difficulty with managing the behavior of their adolescents? And the Parent Resource Center generally does not target supporting families with that age range. But when we deputized them, resourced them, and drew them into the dialogue about what is happening in the families in our communities, they rose to the challenge and developed programs and services for that population. So I think that there's a real opportunity to think beyond the individual cases and think at the level of community here. The last thought that I have on this question, and I guess I think that in terms of seeing the sick leave of child welfare workers as a barometer of the wellness of our system, I'll confess that I think I might have been the instigator of that. I will spare the story, there's no time for it. But if child welfare is in crisis, and if the association responsible for regulating social work has been beating that drum for almost a decade, what will it take for us as a Nova Scotian society, and what will it take from government, from a most senior leadership role? And when I say most senior leadership role, I'm not talking about the Minister of Community Service. I'm talking about the Premier. What is it going to take for this issue to be front and center in a government's agenda? Because it wasn't front and center. We just had a provincial election. This issue was not front and center. No one was talking about it. It wasn't a campaign promise. It wasn't a thought politically. We are in a province that has just experienced two major fatalities related in part to intimate partner violence. And we can see how much money we spent in response to those two inquiries. I don't want to say it out loud because I don't want to jinx us. But what is it going to take for us to pay attention to the crisis in this system so that we can invest proactive energies, monies, and to begin to address this problem? And for those who would say, this is what we are doing from a government point of view, government is always eager to identify the things that they are doing and the money that they are spending currently as the response to all criticism. And I can say categorically, as a person who's been an observer of the system and a worker within and without the system for 35 years, you're missing the mark with your current efforts. And here we have a report from experts who are giving you some advice. Let us see you engage with this report substantially. That would be my final comment.
Thank you so much, Robert. And I don't know if I said that your current hat in here this evening is as president of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. Really appreciate your comments. And I see there are a few comments and questions. And you are also welcome, Robert, to engage in the discussion. I see there's a question about mandatory reporting, a question about training, recommendations around social work education, perhaps, and one about methodology. So I guess I'll ask the team if you'd like to unmute and take a question.
So I can start with that first question in terms of, because it's a question related to the Act and mandatory reporting and how do we change legislation. We are fortunate enough, I don't know if I want to say we're fortunate enough, but within the Act, there is a provision that the Children and Family Services Act needs to be reviewed every 4 years. It does leave the discretion to that review to the Minister of the Community Services, and there's some challenges with that. But right now there is a review underway and a report that's meant to be tabled in March of this year. We do still have, to Robert's point, yes, most political decisions in this province are made by the Premier's office and those who sit around the Premier's table. That's not to negate the fact that we just elected representatives as well, who are accountable to the public policy that we produce here in Nova Scotia. So I would encourage everyone, as Robert said, he encouraged everyone in leadership of the Department of Community Services to engage in this report. I would encourage everyone in this room to engage in some activism around what this report is telling us as well. Writing to your elected official and telling them that the Act needs to be amended is an important step that way. Certainly, as the regulatory body for the profession of social work, we are going to continue to raise the flaws within the Act at this point in time, and we'll release our report, which talks about the challenges in mandatory reporting in advance of the recommendations going to government as well. But we'll take a collective effort and a strong voice. I can tell you, again, that most elected officials, most people have very little understanding of the system, its importance, and the crisis that it's in. You all have a responsibility now to educate your elected official.
And I see that Rebecca has put the helpful link to Using Your Power, this great guide that I think the college has produced. So there's a link in the chat around this. Sorry, I heard a voice.
It was me.
Go ahead.
One of the things, like, I think, Alec, first of all, I think mandatory reporting is a very tough issue to take on because the general public, as Alex is saying, does not understand how that could possibly be a bad thing or how it could harm people. And it really does systematically harm marginalized groups in particular. Some of the language you use is the duty to support rather than the duty to report. But one of the things that I had suggested and put forward to Christine at one point, and because of the election and things sort of took off, and Marjorie's comment, I do think it's very important because a lot of this, what we're saying here, these issues are complicated and it's hard to capture in a soundbite and to get buy-in from a wide variety, like a public body. So I do think there's value in the fact that everyone is in this room today. We have 50 people here who are understanding these issues. I would certainly be happy to write an open letter where maybe we have top 3 asks, which is, starting to trouble the discussion about mandatory reporting and why Child and Youth Advocate Office. There's these very clear policy asks that, if brought from a community to the government's attention, would be very difficult for them to continue to ignore. So I think, there's the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition, which is an amazing group of people in Nova Scotia doing some work around this. But I do think I would love to be involved in and see some concrete act, like getting, as Robert says, getting this report into the hands of the people who need to see it.
Thanks, Brooke. Did anybody else want to comment on that, or on the education question, or on the methodology question? I see a popper behind Brooke.
I would just say something about the mandatory reporting, and I think that mandatory reporting is made all the more problematic because if the professional, particularly who reports, is not perceived as a part of the plan to support the family once they've reported. So, and there are constructions and conceptions of confidentiality and privacy and all of those other concerns. So if a physician who has been serving a family for a generation makes a call to child welfare to say, I have concerns about this client of mine, they have an infant and I'm worried, that report and concern goes into a system that then shuts out that physician, and that physician can't talk to anybody, doesn't know who the social workers are. There's no call back, there's no engagement. So I think that the construction of mandated reporting as a one-way responsibility is highly problematic, particularly when helping professionals aren't reached out to by the system until the last minute. And this is true not only of professionals, but family members. I can say that I had a family member who's in child welfare system, and I was contacted to see if this kid comes into care, could you potentially make a home for them? I said, absolutely, let's have a family meeting. I hear nothing for 7 months until another social worker calls me to say, could you take this kid into your care? So though I was identified as a resource, I was excluded from all of the work that could have been occurring for 7 months. And again, that's because of this construction of, who is the client and what are the boundaries and the barriers around confidentiality and the like. This complex system needs to have more complex and responsive mechanisms for working with families that are so challenged.
Thanks, Robert. Anybody else on any of the comments or questions, Catherine?
Yeah, I can quickly say something, and Nancy, if you want to jump in as well, on the education piece. I think given the complexity of social work practice, social work education doesn't necessarily, and particularly in a small program like the one we have, doesn't necessarily move into some of the technical sort of details, right? And so oftentimes students are left feeling ill-prepared for some of those, again, more sort of technical aspects of their job. What we teach them is to be critical of the systems that they encounter. And I think that makes for good social workers, but it also, as we've been discussing, right, generates the potential or the possibility for this distress, because we train them to be critical, and then we set them loose into these systems that aren't particularly responsive to critical thinking. And so I think that, in response to the question and what can social work education do differently, I suspect we could do, a lot differently. And I know for myself as a social work educator, I am taking the lessons from this project and am thinking about my teaching and training differently as a result of it. And yeah, anyways, thank you to everyone for all of this. And just to say, like, the comments are so amazing, and so exciting to see, like, everyone's engagement. So thank you. Nancy, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add a sentence or two. I think we do at the school a good job of preparing people for critical thinking. And I think that is, as I often say in my class, like, that's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. But I think what we need to do better is how do we blend that with direct practice skills and prepare the students for the workplaces that they enter. Because as this report indicates, we're putting young workers into positions where they have such influence and oftentimes feel so unprepared. So I think it's doing a disservice. So we as a school, I think, have to wrestle with that responsibility further.
I do just want to add to that conversation, and Robert might have something to add as well. It is that we call it social work practice, right? Because it's just that. It is a practice. We have a baseline of education that gives us a grounding point in terms of our values, our critical thinking skills, and again, our abilities to connect and relate to families. And then as we experience applying that theory, we are meant to grow and make meaning and make changes and grow our practice. In a field like child welfare, the ability to create that meaning, the ability to advance those skills and that training, the ability to even process what the heck just happened isn't embedded into it. So you cannot essentially evolve that practice in a particular way. The role of educators is that to educate social workers. It's then on us as a social work community to hold each other accountable to our practice and our systems to support us in advancing it.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm not coming from the social work discipline, so I'm coming from child and youth studies. But one thing I hit up against all the time in my talking with students who are predominantly early childhood educators or want to become child and youth workers, or in my research, is the duty to report, right? Because we have to teach that to students in a particular way. And so that is a very concrete, practice-oriented piece, which brings with it, it unfortunately, just duty to report training itself does not bring a critical lens. So it's up to whoever is going to facilitate that to bring in the critical lens. I think social work students are probably better positioned than early childhood educators or child and youth workers sometimes to be able to be critical of those things. So, and anyways, that's just one clear point of tension in my everyday work in a university that I struggle with.
Yeah, I think, well, I think what we're saying is who's responsible for ensuring that child protection social workers are prepared to do that work. And the answer is not University School of Social Work or the Nova Scotia College of Social Worker or the Department of Community Service that employs them. The answer really is collectively, we are responsible for this, right? That social workers need to have a baseline training that they get in their BSW, that the college has some responsibility for regulating the profession and establishing standards of practice that are applicable in all spaces, and DCS has a responsibility for taking those social workers who are prepared and who are governed and helping them to develop a child welfare practice of social work. If the conditions of the workplace does not enable an individual to develop a practice, then what we have is a situation where you are recruited to a system that then can use you as a body in their calculation of what is the average caseload size here. And if that is the only value of the social worker, okay, you're here, that brings our team's casework average down to 25, get at it, that can't be seen as a viable way to organize a system, right? And so what does that training look like? What does the mentoring look like? What does the graduated taking on of responsibility in a system like child welfare look like? We train physicians who do residency for long periods of time with rotations in different areas of practice as they build their skills. And even when they practice under I don't know what you call the person who oversees interns in a practice, but their proctor or their supervisor, and it is a teaching relationship, right? We don't have that as well defined. And really, when we think about it, in my day in child welfare, casework supervisors were universally individuals with master's degrees. That is not the case anymore in child welfare, I think. So if child welfare supervisors are the proctors, the teachers, the educators, the mentors, are they tooled to do that work today is a question.
Thanks so much, Robert. I think we are going to come to a close. There's some amazing further discussion in the chat, including, I see, Joanna La Tulip Rochon, a family resource programs. So I was going to say, and I see, Sue, your comments around the gendered nature of this work, and that we could replace child protection social workers with many other so-called women's work or caring labor. And I think, Catherine Bryan, you definitely talked about the foundations of capitalism, and maybe you didn't say patriarchy, but that being part of the gendered devaluation of this work, all really critical insights into, where do we go next and what are the focus of action. I like where Brooke was talking about, something concrete around a call for action. So you will all be hearing from us for at least getting the recording of this event, finding the report. And if you would like to continue to hear about our work, you will. I do want to again thank Robert. Thank you very much for your response and for your insights here this evening. Thank you so much to our authors for this incredible report. Thank you to the social workers who shared their time, their very valuable time and experience. Please do read the report. I do want to acknowledge that we did have some additional funding for this project from the NSGU as well as from the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, so I thank them as well. And I want to flag that, after I supported getting this ready for publication, I turned to child and family poverty, and our report card is out next week on Tuesday, and we have cited this report in there because it, lays the foundation to where we go, which is the structural changes that are needed. Yes, to all of what is in this report and your call to action to eradicate poverty. We will underline next week just how difficult it is for so many families in Nova Scotia, so many children. So that will be out next week. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. What an incredible discussion in the chat and a fantastic turnout. Thank you for your time. And thanks again. Have a good evening.